Why do we obsess over growth? We consider this quite a bit, even though things like a rock doesn't think about it at all. Consider how many self-help books there are out there, how many podcasts on self-improvement are popping up, and you can also look at how Stoicism is having a resurgence, along with, other philosophies. Buddhism had a big resurgence back about 15, 20 years ago, and then Stoicism is having it, I guess it started about 10 years ago as well, but it's still resurging. This isn't an arbitrary part of human experience, okay? Growth is absolutely vital, but vital for what? I preluded to this earlier that we have a lot of presuppositions, human beings, us Homo sapiens. We often take things as obvious. We take it for granted. However, if you take a broader look at the cosmos and nature, you'll see that a lot of the things that we take for granted, a lot of the presuppositions that we have, they're not as obvious as you might think. You don't see raccoons having a discussion on self-improvement after all. We can even go a step further. The one I used earlier is that you don't see a rock thinking about self-improvement. And a rock is part of the cosmos, and so it is part of the Stoic God, being nature in and of herself. So why don't rocks value self-improvement? Again, these are things that we seem to take as obvious. Like, of course you want to get better, but why? That's not an obvious answer. And probably you're thinking, well, the reason we want to get better and rocks don't, or raccoons don't, is because we are human beings and we are not. And that's the correct answer, but it really begs the question, what does it mean to be human? If you ask Carl Jung, he would say that consciousness is what makes us human. That is, being conscious, being aware of our vulnerabilities, that, we have the potential to die, we have the potential for mass suffering and pain. And so consciousness, our awareness of this, is what makes us human beings. But it's also awareness of our capacity for good and evil. Again, to throw in a very Carl Jung shadow, pun intended, to this discussion here. So our awareness that we can suffer and die makes us vulnerable. That is our vulnerability, and our awareness of that fact is what makes us conscious, and that is what makes us human. In Genesis, in the Bible, there's an interesting scene where Adam and Eve first become conscious. And they were naked, of course, running around in the woods, as all pre-conscious people did back in the day. And when God granted them consciousness, he basically, gave them embarrassment. They looked down and they saw their parts and they said, oh my God, I am embarrassed about this. I better cover that up. And so the first thing they did was cover up their organs, let's say. And that's not obvious. If you think about why we put clothing on, a dog isn't concerned about you seeing him naked, nor a cat, nor a hamster. They don't care. I mean, they'll clean themselves right in front of you. There's very obvious about that for anyone who's been around cats. This was in many ways, that being Adam and Eve putting the leaf over the organs, that was the start of culture, because they immediately covered up, and that's clothing, and clothing is a part of culture. And what does culture do? Well, according to the Taoists, the culture is part of order, and order gives us structure, and it protects us despite our vulnerabilities. And so that's what culture actually is. What makes us human? What else makes us human? So that's kind of a Carl Jung / biblical idea. If you ask Mircea Eliade, this is a guy who you might not recognize his name, but he studied and wrote a lot of books on the history of religions. More than anyone, he's very, very, very knowledgeable, and just has really given back to this academic community. He'd say that standing upright makes us human. We share a common ancestor with other primates, but other primates such as gorillas and chimpanzees, they actually hunch over. They're very hunched over. They normally walk on four arms / legs, I guess. But we as human beings, we stand upright. We expose ourselves. In fact, standing up straight is something that you have to remind yourself of, because we have this natural tendency to hunch over and protect ourselves. But why do other primates do that? Well, they do it because they're trying to protect their organs, their actual organs, their heart and their stomach area. So when they hunch over, that is a form of protection. But us human beings, no, we have to be vulnerable, so we open it up and leave it exposed for everyone. They're protecting their vital organs because they don't want to expose them to potential predators. But no, we don't do that. In fact, that's why heart-to-hearts exist. If you think about what a heart-to-heart is, it's when you're opening up to each other. It's when you're vulnerable. And so that's what that is. Having a heart-to-heart is standing up straight, is letting your vulnerable part show, which is your heart and your bodily organs as well, and that makes you vulnerable, and that's what a heart-to-heart actually is, exposing your vulnerability. Now, this idea, of course, ties in with Carl Jung's idea about vulnerability, obviously, as I just mentioned there, because standing upright is accepting that vulnerability, and that's really what philosophy as a way of life was, and that's where I'm going to go to with this next, because there's one final piece to this puzzle. Something like Stoicism. Stoicism deems our rational mind as a thing that separates us from the rest of the cosmos, but of course it acknowledges that the cosmic structure is built on rationality. But I'm not going to delve too deep into that, but I want to make it clear that this may seem like a separate idea from that of vulnerability, but it's actually not. They're deeply connected, and the reason is because, as I mentioned in a very recent episode, Stoicism exists in the first place because of our knowledge of vulnerability, of our vulnerability. But the basic idea is that life is suffering, as the Buddhists knew for a very long time, and other religions knew as well, but that we can transcend that suffering with the rational mind, or in other words, with a philosophy as a way of life. Through reason and perspective, we can transcend our fear that comes from the knowledge of our vulnerability. So there's alignment here, even though it's complicated. I suppose you could say that it's the same fundamental problem, but that you're looking at it from a different angle. Long story short, what makes us human is consciousness and our acceptance of our vulnerability, or I would even say our ability to accept our vulnerability and transcend the suffering that is life.